Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of American Medieval. I'm Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I am excited to be joined by Elise Wang, who works on medieval history of modern ideas like felony, which was her first book, and conspiracy theories, which is the second book that she's working on right now. She's an assistant professor at Cal State Fullerton, as well as a Carnegie Fellow. Elise, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is exciting. We were just talking about kind of beforehand, nobody gets to kind of see or hear the kind of before show chatter, but that we've been kind of corresponding for a while. And so this is very exciting to actually meet you, though we haven't actually met in person. Like this is the first kind of meeting.
We're sort of stepping our way towards meeting in person.
Exactly. Like this is life in the digital age, right? Is that you see somebody on social media, oh, that person seems cool. And then maybe you send an email and then you talk and then, you correspond a little bit and then you go on a podcast, right? Because that's what you do.
Well, I think that's the fourth step canonically.
It is.
Then you go on a podcast and then you meet in person.
Then you meet in person. That's right. We will actually, hopefully, knock on wood, kind of meet in person because we do have, a conference panel that is coming up next year, which maybe I'll talk about it at some point, or maybe we'll talk about kind of later on.
Yeah, sounds great.
But thank you for joining us again. And before we get going, I have to say that we have to start with kind of the silly question that we always start these episodes with. So I beg your indulgence here. And it's silly because it involves time machines. This is a different kind of time machine question than maybe you've been asked. I mean, I've been asked about where would you go back in the past to see a historical event or something like that. But our question is, again, a little bit different. So let's imagine for a moment, we have a time machine, single use, but there and back, so you don't have to stay anywhere. But you have to go back to a point in your own past. So this time machine has been presented to you, at least. You have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself that you will someday grow up to be a medievalist. How does a young Elise react to that news?
So the thing I like about this question is there's often the question if you could go back and change a decision that you made.
Yes.
And that question gives me so much anxiety because
yeah.
Who knows if you start moving the blocks at the bottom of the tower, how it's all going to, no, thank you.
We all saw that crappy movie, The Butterfly Effect, right? Like we know this just ends terribly.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you.
Yeah.
So this is better. This is sort of a snapshot of who I was then. I think I would have had a lot of questions.
As you would. Like, you're from the future? Yeah.
No. That
would have been fine? Okay.
Yeah. Look, I was like most of us, I think, kids who ended up academics. I lived a lot in my head. And so, sure, maybe there's a time machine and I come from the future. That's much less flummoxing than what's a medievalist? Also, what's a professor? I didn't have academic parents. I didn't have any sense that professor was a profession, researcher was a profession.
Sure.
I think I probably watched the Disney Robin Hood, so I had some sort of sense of that general past period.
Sure.
I would not have identified that in any particular era. And it actually took me I think, unlike a lot of medievalists, it took me a long time to settle on the time period. And what is more consistent and what I think you can trace back to childhood is sort of an interest in the history of language. So my mom's not an academic, but she has this facility and sophistication with language that surpasses most academics I know. And she grew up very Catholic over the Vatican II period. And so she started with the Latin Mass and then ended with the English Mass and was very upset about the transition because she loved the Latin so much. And she sort of taught herself the Latin through the liturgy.
Oh, wow.
And then for the rest of her life was just really interested in etymologies. And she's not an academic, doesn't do any of this, but she, got us a used Oxford English dictionary And I would ask what a word meant, and she'd be like, let's look it up. And we'd spend a lot of time talking about not the meaning, but like the etymology, where it came from
Yeah.
and how it changed over time. That was like a really big part of my childhood, especially because English wasn't my first language. And so, like, English came into my life in this sort of historical way.
Sure.
So I think that was probably something that you can trace to the present. And then I was always, I do a lot of legal history, and I was always interested in the law. I always found that fascinating. And, in the nerdy ways of like the procedures and the kind of Rube Goldberg machine aspect of the law, that you press this button and then this happens and then you have to do these steps.
Yeah.
OCD child, I love that. But I also really loved the idea that you could come up with a set of rules that would enable people with really sort of diverse backgrounds and interests and desires and character to live together in a way that was good for everybody. And like that's the ideal of the law. Obviously, it doesn't do that, but that's the ideal. And I sort of had this naive love of that idea. Those things I would have recognized. The medieval thing, probably not.
So there was no kind of background, like other than kind of the Robin Hood movie, which is canonically the best Robin Hood movie, the Disney one. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, the fox. He's a fox.
The fox. Absolutely. 1,000%. Yeah. But there was nothing else because, I mean, I've been asking this question now for a few months and, a bunch of people that have been answering it. There always seems to be, not in all cases, but in many cases, something there like an interest in fantasy, Tolkien, other kind of fantasy novels, video games, increasingly, were important to me, for example, just even growing up. So what brought you then into the Middle Ages themselves? Was it something kind of in college? Was it even something kind of beyond that? Because, I mean, there's plenty of medievalists, too, who start off, one of my friends, started off as a math major and just kind of took a history course and then decided to go to grad school in history and, kind of went from there. But was there kind of a spark that led you to the Middle Ages, or was it just kind of a gradual thing and you just kind of stumbled into it eventually?
It's a really good question. I have tried for myself to identify the kind of moment, but I don't think there really was one. It was more that the questions that I was interested in ended up being the questions that medievalists were asking.
Oh, yeah.
So I was really interested in the sort of, I feel like medievalists, a lot more than other periods, have articulated the problem of how do we actually see these people who are so distant, so foreign from us as people? How do we connect to them? How do we genuinely feel something for them with just sort of the barest evidence, right? Like 4 lines in a coroner's roll or something.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this so I made the very unfortunate choice, and I highly recommend against this, to write an article for an issue on trauma. And of course, I was like, sure, I write about crime. I can write about trauma. And so the things that I was working on at the time were first finders, which were the people in England. The sort of criminal law system began with whoever found the body or saw the crime. And that person was called the first finder.
Oh, okay.
And they kind of initiated the whole legal process. So if you were a first finder, your job was to literally run into the street and yell about it. And it was called raising the hue and cry. Then you had all of these other legal obligations that followed from that. Like you had to testify at the coroner's inquest. You often had to, if it was a murder trial, you had to continue on to the later stages as well. And so I was working on first finders, and I noticed that a lot of the first finders were parents.
Oh.
Parents of the dead child, often.
Yeah.
For some reason, I was like, yeah, let me write an article about this. This won't be traumatizing at all.
Dear Lord. Okay.
It's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about this idea of connecting to these people because I just sobbed over this article. Like, it was so terrible to write.
Yeah.
And a lot of it were these tiny little death rolls of children. And, one which was Solomon, who was 8, who climbed out on a tree over the river to get a flower, and he fell in and drowned. I always found the most heartbreaking part of it is that the role specified very briefly that he had been told not to do that. And it's just because it's a parent telling the story and saying, but I told him not to. which is like, I'm already tearing up because this, like, you can get the whole sort of parental experience, like, that parent, that child, and
Yeah.
the whole thing was maybe 25 words.
Yeah.
The whole, like, record was 25 words. I was really drawn to doing that work. And I feel like medievalists are both really good at that and really care about that. And it felt to me like something that was applicable everywhere, right? This is a method that you can use to connect to people that you feel like you have no connection to at any period in any place. So I think that's probably the thing that drew me to medieval studies.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting about the way that doing this type of historical work can, I don't know what to say, create, but maybe unleash kind of empathy, within the sources and just understanding them. Because, as you're describing this little boy, Solomon, this one kind of anecdote, like I'm picturing it, right? Like the imaginative element kind of comes out about the mother having that conversation with this young kid, like, that's dangerous, don't do that.
Don't do that.
And then, like, it's a whole kind of story, and it emerges, as you were saying, just from these 4 lines, 4 or 5 lines in this one little kind of legal text. And that's a lot of what we do, because we are dealing with such a paucity of sources oftentimes when we're talking about, the medieval world, many more sources than most people think we have. Let's be clear about that. But at the same time, like, they're often not trying to tell us the story that we want to tell, which is to kind of humanize and recognize that there were people in the past, and that poor grieving family, understanding kind of what happened and making sure to mention, like, but I told him not to.
Yeah.
Like, is heartbreaking.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that method of working against the sources, I feel like that's always kind of a balancing act, right? Because you do want to get to the human experience behind the source, but you also in some ways want to respect what the source is actually trying to communicate.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I feel like I'm always trying to balance how far I'm going to run away with reading between the lines and things like that. It's something that I also find very rewarding, because that question is never answered. You always are asking yourself, like, how far do I go? How much do I extrapolate from these kinds of sources? So in that way, it is like both a detective project and an ethical project.
Yeah, no, I like that. I have a lot of friends who, talk about how they read mysteries, like when they kind of pleasure read and stuff like that. And like, I can't do that and I think it's because I feel like I do that at work all day. When I'm doing it. Yeah. So, like, I want a different kind of reading when I'm doing that. So I stay away from kind of mysteries, because I don't want to puzzle something out. Like, I'm doing all the puzzling kind of at work. So
yeah. Well, and now that you say that, I always loved detective stories. I always loved the sort of like discovery thing. So I could see that's probably also part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of part of the historian's toolkit. And by historian too, like, I mean kind of very broadly, anybody who's kind of working on the past, right? Is you are always, regardless, if you're a medievalist or not, like, you're confronted by sources that don't want to tell you the things that you want to know oftentimes. And so, you do have to work them out. But I think there is something unique about a source that is written in a different language, in a vastly different context than ours, that seems familiar in a lot of ways, but is really fundamentally different than the world that we live in today. That's interesting too, because, your recent work, and this is what's called in the podcast world a segue, your recent work on conspiracy theories does try to kind of bridge medieval and modern, right? To kind of move across different time periods. And I think it's something that medievalists generally can be very good at. Some medievalists kind of recoil at doing that work, and for lots of good reasons, they often don't want to do that. But, understanding how something in the past influences something kind of in subsequent generations, even across centuries, that's something that we oftentimes do. So before we kind of get into that, I wanted to ask you, all right, so you're working on a book about conspiracy theories, a project on kind of medieval conspiracy theories. Like, what led you to that? Like, how is it that you got interested in the idea of conspiracy theories? Because I think we think of that oftentimes, or maybe it's just me, or maybe it's, I'm assuming on behalf of our audience, that that's a modern phenomenon.
Yes.
But it's not.
No, it is definitely not. And I think the way that I got interested in it was not actually sort of medieval roots of modern conspiracy theories. It was more that maybe like 20 2016, people started talking about the effect of conspiracy theories on public discourse, and it kind of ramped up with Pizzagate and the rise of QAnon and things like that.
Yeah.
And I was interested in the way that it was being studied because I think, like many people, I was like, why are these compelling stories? I study stories for a living. That's an interesting question. And I found that a lot of the studies on conspiracy theories really focused on this issue of belief. Like, why do people believe? How do they come to believe? How can we stop them from believing? And it really seemed to me immediately kind of the wrong question to ask about conspiracy theories if you're thinking about them as stories. It was sort of from my medievalist training that I recognized that that's not the kind of story a conspiracy theory is. So we are treating conspiracy theories as though they are nonfiction claims. They are a claim about the world and how it works that is held as though it has a sort of stable relationship to truth. And so we went about on all of these campaigns to correct misinformation, to combat media illiteracy, and to sort of teach people to correct themselves or to correct them. And then study after study showed that this had no effect, or in fact, a backlash effect, that the more you tried to correct conspiracy theories, the tighter people held on to them. That seemed to me very intuitive because people who hold conspiracy theories don't hold them like nonfiction stories. They hold them like something much older. And they sounded immediately to me like miracle tales or like Historia, the kind of the history writing, the chronicle writing of the medieval period in which, you would tell true things about the way the world was. But it was expected that you might take a few liberties to accurately represent that.
Sure.
You might exaggerate some things. You might tell a story that's not entirely substantiated, but that the point was to convey the truth of the history itself. And this kind of more playful subordination of kind of what we might consider nonfiction to a narrative, to the story of how things work, how things are. And I say that that's very old, but it's also modern as well. I think that we hold most of our sort of stories about ourselves in that way.
Yeah.
We don't hold them like nonfiction beliefs. And the example I always give my students is the family lore. We all have those stories about our families that are not totally accurate. Like if we went back and we really interrogated Grandpa's story about the war, not every aspect of it would be, shall we say, in sort of nonfiction relationship to reality. But we all understand that they convey something true about the family. And they have created the identity of the family. And so the function of that kind of story is not to act like a news report. It is to act like a story about identity and who we are at our core. And that, I think, is what conspiracy theories do. So I think I went to the medieval period as a way of giving some models for this way that we hold stories that we don't really talk about explicitly. We talk about fiction and nonfiction. Our sense of anything in between is really fuzzy and we don't have the language for it. But the medieval period has great language for it. So that's kind of how the project started, was trying to understand the present, actually.
That's really interesting. I'm struck by your mention of, or just kind of in passing, but about kind of the function of a story being about something true rather than something necessarily being kind of factually accurate. And I'm thinking about, some of my own research kind of very early on in my career when I worked on medieval legends, specifically on the legend of Charlemagne and kind of narrative history, creating these stories about Charlemagne and subsequent centuries about him going to Jerusalem, which he never did, doing all this stuff with relics, which he never did, but about how it created the thing that made the most sense about who Charlemagne was. Like it revealed some truth to the teller about those things. And so those types of stories, as you're kind of describing it, in which they create community and they reveal something that's not neatly confined to nonfiction and fiction seems to really resonate kind of in the way that medievals kind of thought about themselves and kind of about their world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really good example, because when you are surrounded by stories like that, I think another misconception we have is that, medieval people, because they were surrounded with tales of miracles, just sort of naively believed all of them.
Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That they had this sort of uncritical relationship to these stories. And I think that's actually an inheritance of how we would have a relationship to these stories. We are far more credulous, I think, than medieval people would have been. They were better equipped to understand that the story was inviting some kind of relationship with it, some kind of interrogation with it. Like if you think about legends or you think about miracle tales in particular, I've been writing about miracle tales. There's almost always, whenever a miracle is presented, some kind of alternative.
Mm-hmm.
For Saint Winifred in England, the lore is that her head was chopped off and it rolled down a hill, and a spring sprang up from the ground at the place where her head landed.
Yeah.
Immediately, the chronicler says, but there was already water there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so this might have just been, a natural spring.
Yeah.
And you often get I would say in more miracles than not, you get this alternative earthly explanation that is offered to you. And it's an invitation to investigate that for yourself. Not to sort of investigate in the sense of look up the facts, but to think to yourself, what would it mean if I believed this was true? What would it mean if I doubted it? And so it invites you to kind of play across the boundaries there between belief and doubt.
Yeah.
And we don't have quite this facility with that anymore, because we don't have that kind of writing. Even though we have stories that we hold in this way, that stories that might be true or might not be true, we don't have this sophisticated sort of practice with thinking about our own belief.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, too, when I talk about miracle stories with my students, for example, when we use hagiography or any sort of kind of, religious or Christian text within the medieval period, is oftentimes the first question they ask is like, well, did it happen? And then they oftentimes sometimes reach immediately for, well, here's the scientific explanation for this, why this phenomenon may have actually happened. And it is really oftentimes a push to get them to think about like, okay, fine. But like, what is the story doing? Like, that's the question we need to kind of be asking before we can get about like, because I think absolutely this makes so much sense to me about like medievals would have read this very differently. They may have asked that question like, well, what may have actually happened? But they would have been thinking in very different ways. Like, why is this person telling me this story? What is this supposed to be revealing to me? And then I can use my facilities in order to kind of discern what I do with that information.
Yeah. And if I am someone from this place who attaches meaning to sort of the local saint, what does it give me to believe that there were miracles performed?
Yeah.
I think the sort of move to scientifically explain it is a move to foreclose all of the other possibilities. That's not what miracle tales are about. They are about enjoying the sort of experience of believing impossible things. And so in the same way that we really like ghost stories, I think that's maybe a better example, is like we all really like ghost stories. And we like them when there are alternatives presented and we get to sort of figure out where we sit.
Yeah.
That sort of active participation in our own belief. That's the meat of the story.
Yeah, I'm thinking too, like, and maybe this is just revealing a little bit too much about me, but about like when you're out at a bar with a friend and they tell you a story there, it's just like that story is in a particular context, meant to do a certain thing. Like, did it actually happen? Like, I have certain friends, I doubt that any story they tell me actually maybe happened, but like it opens up the possibility of belief, and it is conveying a sense of, kind of community within that particular moment, right?
Yeah, and I feel like that is the community aspect of it is something that actually things like social media and wider media have kind of evacuated, because you don't have the personal relationship with the person such that you want to give them that benefit of the doubt and you want to play along like it's a game, right? You want to play along. It creates this closeness, this intimacy with the person. It creates this sort of shared belief in something that may or may not be true. But That's the point of the story, is the togetherness.
Yeah. Like as we were talking about at the very beginning, right? Stage 1, social media. Stage 2, emailing. Stage 3, going on a podcast with someone, and then eventually kind of meeting in person, right? Like you need to move through all of them. And if you stop at stage 1, you haven't established enough of rapport in order to understand what is being communicated in that particular way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So everybody should be on my podcast. This is what I'm saying. Like, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then the next step is drinking in a bar. That's right. My understanding. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And I was going to say, I feel like a really good example of this kind of helping students to slow down their attempt to foreclose the possibilities. A really good text for this is the Marjorie Kemp autobiography. So Marjorie Kemp was a visionary in 14th century England, and she was also the first autobiographer in English. And so she wrote her own autobiography. She, it seems, had help with the actual physical writing, but most people had help with the actual physical writing at that point. And so she composed her own autobiography, and one of the scenes in it is this very graphic description of after she has had her baby. And I'm even holding myself back from using modern terms for this. She has had her first child. She had 14, but she had her first child. A lot of children. Can you imagine? She had her first child and then had these visions of demons tearing at her flesh and telling her to harm herself, to harm her child, telling her to lash out at her husband. And she has this very visceral understanding that these demons are surrounding her and there's flames and violence. And all of my students immediately say, well, it's postpartum psychosis, right? This is postpartum depression. This is postpartum psychosis. Yes, that's probably what we would call it now. But also this experience and the way that she describes it as demons is the first thing that she talks about in this story about how she became a preacher and a visionary and was sent on this mission from God to tell people about her encounters with Christ. So it is very important to this story that it was demons, actually. That it wasn't postpartum psychosis, that these were actually demons who came to torment her after the birth of her child. And like, what if we took her seriously? What if we did that for her? Because that's what enabled her whole life. And that's what enables this text to exist and for us to receive it. And I feel like that, especially because it's such a violent and vulnerable kind of scene, that kind of breaks through to them that like, actually, maybe we should respect the way she talks about it. Like maybe we should leave that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really great way to approach these sources oftentimes because like we were talking about, right? The first instincts we have today is to just say like, okay, what's quote unquote really going on here? Right. But the story is trying to tell us, or the narrative, I should say, is trying to tell us something. So first we need to understand, what is it trying to tell us? How is the story structured in order to get us to where it wants to take us? We can accept that or not, but that's a separate question. But we need to first understand it kind of at that basic level about how this woman in the 15th century, I want to say?
Yeah, she's late 14th, early 15th.
Okay, good. Anything after 1100 is a little bit kind of weird to me. So like, I got to say as an early medievalist, but so I was reaching there, but I'm glad I was kind of in the right area. But anyway, what this 15th century woman is really trying to say and how people in their own time would have kind of received it. Howdy, partners. Do you have a few minutes to help us out? Our podcast collective, Multitude, home to American Medieval, This Guy Sucked, Spirits, and other great podcasts, wants to hear from you. Please take a moment and head to multitudeshows.com/survey to take Multitude's annual listener survey. It takes just a few minutes and helps us out tremendously. We always try to bring you consistent episodes, high-quality ads, relevant social media content, and helpful emails. And this survey is how we figure out who you are, what you're looking for, and how we can help. Plus, every survey ends with a collage of Multitude pet pics. So please take a couple of minutes and head to multitudeshows.com/survey. multitudeshows.com/survey. You can do it now, even while you're finishing this episode. Thanks so much. I do want to kind of go back to conspiracy theories specifically
Yes.
because, one of the things that we're troubled by today, and it seems to be, or maybe just this is an assumption of mine, and so please correct me if I'm wrong, is that conspiracy theories oftentimes are quite harmful, right? Is that they do create kind of conditions in which kind of actual, violence can be meted out, conditions in which groups are kind of persecuted or there's real danger kind of involved. So is there a point at which we can say like, or maybe there's kind of a starting point in your work, like where do conspiracy theories within the medieval world come from? Or is there a sense that they've always kind of just been with us and we're just going to kind of pick it up here in the medieval world and then kind of see where it goes from there?
Yeah, so obviously there have always been conspiracy theories because there
Sure.
have always been conspiracies. We understand the idea of a dark force behind the scenes
Yeah.
making things happen that we don't understand. So absolutely, there have always been conspiracy theories. But there is kind of an inciting moment for the conspiracy theories that we recognize today. So
Okay.
things like blood libel,
Mm,
which is the conspiracy theory that Jewish people crucify and drink the blood of Christian children at Passover. It's very specific, but it's then been kind of mutated into a sort of general blood drinking ritual that shows up all over the place,
yeah.
obviously. And it always has this undercurrent of anti Semitism and anti Judaism, but it has been applied, J.D. Vance bringing this up
Yeah.
in the last election cycle, saying that Haitians are eating the pets. That's a blood libel. And it's this idea that this malicious outsider force that is living in our midst is preying on our most vulnerable. So blood libel and also well poisoning and the idea of sort of contagion in the water is another one that we continue telling. Another one is the secret society.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The secret society has these secret rituals and they're all connected and they secretly run the world. And then the last one is this sort of that there is this savior-like figure who is going to come Deus Ex Machina out of the background and set everything to rights. And that was the QAnon theory, right? That Donald Trump or some sort of institution associated with him was going to come and just purge the swamp.
Sure.
And all four of these began right at the end of the Crusades. And so they all kind of spring up within 200 years of each other, 100 years actually of each other,
Yeah.
right as the Crusades begin to fail. And so that's kind of the moment that I'm working on is the moment of the failure of the Crusades and why these stories end up coming out of them. Why do we start telling these stories and how do they become so pernicious that we still are telling these stories? These are the stories that are not like pigeons don't exist conspiracy theories. These are the conspiracy theories.
Oh, that takes me back. Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? There's some fun Area 51 kind of conspiracy theories, so that we can also turn dark. There are some fun conspiracy theories. These are the ones that really cause problems. These are the ones that lead to violence. So the sort of question of what I'm working on is how does that come and why does that come out of the end of the Crusade?
Yeah.
And the thing about that moment, which is very recognizable to our current one, is I imagine longtime listeners of your podcast know kind of the story of the Crusades and how it didn't really work out. But basically, they didn't really work out. And
They did not.
The first one seemed like it was going to be a success. They took Jerusalem. It was very swift, but it was also very bloody and very horrifying. And a lot of crusaders came back victorious, but a little bit tentative. And there's one who came back and said, I thought, and he offers this sort of like as an afterthought. He's like, I thought Christ died for our sins and not for land in Jerusalem. So there's already this kind of pullback, even from the victorious First Crusade.
Yeah.
Every crusade after that is various shades of failure. It never actually starts this sort of upward trend that they hope,
Yep.
but they sink 200 years of men and money into this venture. And countries all over Europe and the church sink everything basically into this venture. And they build whole financial systems, whole kingdoms around the Crusades. And then at a certain point you have to call it. And as they begin to call it, that's when you get these stories.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, I think, the moment. And so then the question is why? Why? What's the connection there? And for me, I think the connection is that the idea that we have sunk 200 years, 10 generations of men into this failed venture, and it actually did fail, and everybody has to admit that it failed. That's a horrifying story. Even worse is the idea that it may have been a mistake to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what starts emerging, and it is unavoidable at the end of a failed venture. And, there's the famous John Kerry quote, how do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? This idea that the whole thing might have been a mistake. And that's a really intolerable thing to feel, I think, as a civilization. Personally, it's an intolerable thing to feel like that whole thing was a mistake. Like, not only did it fail, it was a mistake. And so it is incredibly hard to sit with that kind of an idea. It's much easier to say, well, they betrayed us, or it was really these sort of traitors in our midst, or the crusade might still come back someday if we get the savior from over the seas who is ready to fight for us.
Yeah.
There are these sorts of attempts not to move on from this failure, because none of the conspiracy theories say, okay, yes, this was maybe a mistake and we failed and it was kind of our fault. None of them say that. They all have some sort of way of refusing the present failure and deflecting to something else, deflecting the story to, it was the lepers are poisoning the wells and they're actually this sort of insidious force that we need to turn our crusader sort of energy towards.
Yeah.
That there's all of these sort of different ways of dealing with the fact that we don't want to deal with the failure.
Yeah.
And I think that has made the most sense to me for thinking about conspiracy theories in general, that they're a way to avoid hard feelings about yourself.
Is this a form of scapegoating in some way, or do you think it's kind of something a little bit more involved? Because I'm struck by, there has to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? But there has to be, in some ways, an acceptance that the venture has been a failure.
Mm-hmm.
Like that you have to kind of understand that like that didn't work out for whatever reason. Then the question turns to why.
Yeah.
Why didn't it work out? Or why did we, as you said, like why did we get into this in the first place? And pointing fingers at some external force that is hidden or has been hidden, quote unquote hidden, and then revealing like a truth again, like, and that goes back to kind of the stories that, how we were talking about stories before, is not necessarily fact but truth about what was really going on this whole time.
Yeah. So I think there are kind of conspiracy theories for different stages.
Okay.
So if we think about different stages of grief, there are different stages of failure. I think blood libel comes first, and it did chronologically. Okay. It's the kind of, if we just purge the evil at home, that will turn the venture around.
Sure.
So blood libel began after the Second Crusade, and it was actually, it took off in response to a trial of a crusader for murdering a Jew.
Yeah.
And so it's brought up in his defense when Simon de Nevers comes back from the Second Crusade, and he has borrowed heavily from Eliezer, a Jew in Norwich. And he comes back from the Second Crusade in deeper debt and in failure, as they all did. And he sends his men to murder Eliezer. So he's brought up on charges for having done this in front of the king. And the bishop gets up, so Simon is the bishop's vassal. So the bishop gets up in his defense and says, well, sure, murder should be punished, but first, the Jews have to answer for a murder of their own. And he calls back to this kind of older story that was kind of unsuccessful in Norwich about how the Jews of Norwich had murdered William, a 12-year-old boy who was found dead in the woods outside Norwich. And he uses this as the defense of Simon. And that story of William becomes blood libel, and it's the thing that still survives today. And so that's kind of an early, like a hey, look over there kind of attempt.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It is scapegoating, but it's much more of a sort of like the bishop literally says, sure, murder bad, but look over here.
Yeah.
And it's completely non sequitur. then once you get further into the failure, you get different kinds of responses. And so for the lepers plot, which comes later, this is a plot in the 14th century, or a conspiracy theory in the 14th century, that the lepers of France and Spain or Aragon were poisoning the wells.
Yeah.
It's before actually all of the conspiracy theories about well poisoning that we're familiar with during the Black Death. This is before that. This is in 1314. So it seems to kind of come out of nowhere, but what it actually comes out of is a failed attempt to restart the Crusades. So the Crusades have been dead for about 20 years. And there is something called the Shepherd's Crusade, and it's a sort of peasant uprising against the King of France, who has given up on the Crusades. He's not interested. Philip V is very obviously interested in sort of standardizing the economy, and he's a little OCD economist. He's not interested in the Crusades.
Yeah.
He's interested in weights and measures. And his people rise up against him in the Shepherd's Crusade, calling for him to lead them on a march south to the only Muslims left in continental Europe, in Iberia.
Yeah.
And he says, no, thank you. And they start marching south and just basically rioting. They start burning things on their way south. And finally, he rounds them up and puts them on trial. And they, at trial, start this rumor that the lepers have been poisoning the wells. And so it's again out of a trial, this like attempt to deflect or defend, to change the story of what was going on.
Oh,
that
yeah.
actually this whole story that we couldn't continue. No, actually, let's talk about the lepers and this threat to Christendom, because then once the lepers plot conspiracy theory takes off, it starts reaching back into the Crusades. So it becomes the Jews are backing the lepers, and then it becomes the king of Granada, the Muslim king of Granada, is backing the Jews who are backing the lepers. And so you start reaching into this different narrative of the Crusades. So it is scapegoating. It's also something a little bit more narratively complex.
Yeah. No, it seems like it has a lot to do with feelings, or not feelings maybe, but a sense of culpability.
Mm-hmm.
And like you were saying, kind of like a deflection, right? I'm curious too, though, kind of related to that, is you mentioned about the William of Norwich story,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting and really terrible in lots of different ways, but that it seems to take root at a particular moment. And like, is there anything that we can say about the importance of context within these cases, right? Is that like blaming the lepers? Like there had been lepers and, kind of a very complicated and in fact, really interesting kind of relationship within the Christian community towards lepers. But then they become scapegoated later in the Middle Ages. Jews, unfortunately, within Christian Europe, like oftentimes bear the brunt of a lot of anti-Jewish violence. But like the previous attempt at, making William of Norwich a story fails.
It does.
And it's only the second time that it takes off at that particular moment. So how can we, and I think this is something that we as historians always have to confront, right? Is just like context really is important.
Why now?
When these things, why now, right? So is there anything that we can say about that? Or is it really very specific to the type of story that we're talking about?
Well, I do think there's something specific, and it is that conspiracy theories are really good at achieving a particular sort of political or economic end for their teller. Like they do that really, really well. And so in this moment, William of Norwich is brought out to excuse Simon de Nevers. And he's actually not acquitted. All this does is cause this kind of riot in the courtyard, and the king flees, and he's like, I'm done. Like, I'm out.
Yeah.
And so Simon is never tried. And so it's not even that he gets acquitted for this. It is actually just that you kind of blow things up.
Yeah.
Conspiracy theories are very good at blowing things up.
Okay.
And when it didn't take off, I think there was just not enough for it to do. With the story of William of Norwich, so it began, William's uncle actually was the first to tell it, and he sort of came up with this story about how the Jews had killed William. It was very kind of half-baked. It was not a particularly sophisticated tale. And also the other context is that Norwich was actually kind of one of the centers of Jewish life in England.
Mm-hmm.
By the time of the expulsion, Norwich was 10% Jewish. It had the sort of most prolific and famous Jewish English poet, Meyer of Norwich. And it ended up being a place where a lot of Jews in England fled from violence elsewhere.
Mm.
And actually, even after the blood libel took off, there wasn't violence against the Jews in Norwich. It did not cause
Really?
the pogrom that it caused elsewhere. Yeah.
Huh.
And so when it took off in Norwich, the story took off. But really where it started causing violence was as it traveled through these Benedictine monasteries. So Thomas of Monmouth is the one who writes it down and spreads it. And he's a Benedictine. And so it spreads through the Benedictine monasteries. And that's when it starts causing violence is elsewhere. But Norwich actually ends up continuing to be kind of safe. Really the thing that made it spark is that it got Simon de Nevers off. Like, that's it. It ends up being these very sort of pedestrian, petty little grievances. And you see this with the lepers plot as well, because what really ends up making it take off is so just a little context. Leprosy is a lifelong disease. It is also still not very well understood epidemiologically because it has such a long incubation period that you can show signs of it between 1 and 20 years after you are infected.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult actually to catch it and to treat it. It's a bacterial infection, so it is treatable now. So it was very poorly understood, but it was understood to be something that was lifelong. So lepers were generally confined or asked to return at night to leprosaria, these kinds of institutions that were made for them, but they were also seen as objects of charity, and you were supposed to give to leprosaria in order to support them. Leprosy was associated with sin, but in the sort of way that we are all associated with sin. And so it wasn't clear that they were kind of this hated minority. However, they did have a lot of property. This ended up being the catalyst for the riots against the lepers. You might not believe that the lepers are dropping sort of their own hairs and skins of lizards into the wells to poison them.
Yeah.
But you kind of like their stuff. Like,
yeah, they're easy targets. Yeah.
They're easy targets. And so you burn down the leprosarium, you take their stuff and go on your way. And it also ends up being a way to settle these sort of petty grievances in all sorts of places. You get all of these accusations that someone is a leper so that you can take their stuff. There's one in particular I'm thinking of where one brother accused another of being a leper, and they had a long-standing property dispute that was magically resolved when his brother was executed for his part in the lepers plot. So I think we think of conspiracy theories as conspiracies in themselves, these kind of dark clouds that move without our sort of will or volition, and they spread and infect, when actually they end up spreading because of the most sort of quotidian, stupid desires that we all have, like little bits of greed and, resentment and feeling like you didn't get what you deserved in life, like all of these sort of most basic impulses.
Yeah, it seems like, that these conspiracy theories are useful,
Yes.
to certain people in certain moments, if I'm understanding this correctly. And maybe that explains some of why they are able to kind of survive and travel through time, despite, like, as you said, kind of at the outset, like a lot of attempts at trying to kind of quash these things by pointing out they're incorrect. People don't necessarily care that they're incorrect.
They do not care.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like J.D. Vance did me a great favor with the way that he talked about his blood libel against Haitians, because when pressed on the veracity of these claims, and, the mayor of Springfield comes out and says, this is not happening, he says, if I have to make up stories to help the American people see what's going on, then that's what I'm going to do. So he admits that it's not true.
Yeah.
He's not asking that anybody believe that it's true. He's saying he doesn't believe that it's true. He is pointing specifically to its utility. right? It
Yeah.
makes people see something true, like in the larger sense of truth.
With a capital T, truth. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. It makes people see this true thing that is not sullied by these details.
Yeah. So, we are kind of unfortunately kind of running towards the end of our time. So I just have one tiny little question, maybe to cap things off. Can a conspiracy theory be stopped then? Just a
No. Okay.
tiny little question. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Okay.
No.
And end of episode. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think the answer is actually yes. I think like the other part of this whole history that is most sort of interesting and hopeful for me and helps me keep on working on these horrible things is that there were always moments where it could have not happened. And I think
Oh, yeah.
historians know this in a way that we don't always communicate to our students and to the public because we're talking about how things did happen, which makes sense. But you have all of these fugitive moments of where things really could have been different. And I think you really see this in the William of Norwich story. Like Godwin Sturt, his uncle, tries to get this thing off the ground for 5 years and he gets nowhere. His neighbors are like, "You're crazy." He goes to the bishop and the bishop is like, "Sounds wrong." Even when there is finally the accusation at the Simon de Nover's trial, the Jews of Norwich take refuge in the castle, and the sheriff protects them, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
And so there are all of these moments where it really could have gone differently. And so I think maybe they have to be stopped earlier than we think. I think they can't be corrected. I don't think at that point it is too late. That is not where we have to intervene, but the sort of utility of them is, I think, the place you have to attack. You have to make them less useful. You have to make there was no use for the William of Norwich story before Simon de Nover's, and so it didn't happen.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Like one of the things that would defang, like J.D. Vance, for example, just to take that example, right, is to make sure that the community that he's attacking is seen as a valuable part of, the fabric of American society, right? Like immigrant communities are part of America. And if they are not marginalized and maligned, then that attack on them becomes less useful in that sense, right?
Yeah. And I think sort of in a sort of ironic way, the ramp up of ICE and the visibility of ICE has forced us to articulate in ways that I think everybody thought were obvious, or most people I thought were obvious, but maybe were not being actively articulated, the sort of heart of America as an immigrant society, that this is something we identify with and value, that the fabric of our everyday lives is made up with immigrants. And we all thought maybe that didn't have to be said, but it does have to be said. And so now we are articulating that more strongly in a way that we weren't maybe before.
Yeah. There we go. Hope.
Yeah, hope. There you go. Right.
But I love too, what you mentioned about the contingency of history, which is something that I think we oftentimes, especially in public communication, try to communicate, but maybe we do need to actually really bring to the forefront is like, this is what did happen, but it didn't have to have happened that way. And there were lots of moments at which it could have happened otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's really important, not just thinking about the past, but oftentimes thinking about our own world is that like we are not trapped in a timeline in any way, shape, or form, right? That things could be different if we acted in certain ways.
Yeah, and I think historians really do try to do that in public communication, but we're working against this, mantra of history repeats itself, and we love seeing sort of the things that happened before being repeated now. Like, obviously, it's a pattern, it's satisfying, but that gives it this sense of inevitability. Like, we are trapped in a timeline, as you say, and that, like, when you actually get down to thinking about exactly what happened in the records and the people involved, there were so many ways it could have gone differently and just so many little things. I mean, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, like, I don't want to change any decision I made in my life. Who knows how that could happen?
Yeah.
There are those moments.
There are those moments because everything could just go off in a different direction. So we are unfortunately kind of running towards the end of our time. So I think we might need to call it there. Elise, this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. If people want to find out more about you or your work and they have a thing called the internet, is there a place that you would direct them to? Yeah,
so I have a website. It's just elisedwang.com. And it has sort of the recent things I've done. I've talked about conspiracy theories a lot, mostly conspiracy theories. Interestingly, not that many people are interested in the medieval origin felony. I haven't figured that out, but most of the stuff that I've done is on conspiracy theories. So that's all available on my website.
Okay, well, if there are any legal scholars out there listening, please contact Elise. She's chomping at the bit to talk about the origin of felony too. And the way that the medieval is being invoked in a lot of public discourse about American law and stuff like that, I think they could stand to talk to some historians, I will say. So, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Elise. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody for listening to another episode of American Medieval. Hopefully, we'll see you again next week. Until then, take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.